Hello everybody, I'm going to take a look at this particular paper called Increase the Intake of Refined Carbohydrates and Sugar May Have Led to the Health Decline of the Greenland Eskimos. And the reason I'm interested in this one is for the following reason. Now, even though it's only been cited 6 times in the literature and in most cases by marginal publications that have nothing directly to do with the hypotheses being proposed, and then 2 other times by the authors themselves. This publication has been talked about extensively on social media. It always gets brought up whenever people talk about the Eskimos, the Inuit. So I don't think this is worth responding to in a more formal format, but I think this is worth responding to in a video or a blog format because it has little academic relevance, but it's commonly cited popularly. What is the purpose of this article? Well, there's a systematic review by Fodor et al. In 2014 that talked about whether or not the lower rate of coronary artery disease among the Inuit was real. And what's the context of that particular discussion? Well, here I am on Zad Chow's website, Less Likely. The context of that particular claim is that in the 1970s, a group of explorers led by Bang and Dyerberg, I think are the 2 lead people known for this particular set of studies, looked at the Inuit and made the claim that they had lower incidences of heart disease. And then ever since then, it's been trying to be explained why that's the case, because the Inuit ate a lot of saturated fat and a lot of animal products, and not very much fruits and vegetables and that kind of thing. So the paradox is how the Inuit could have such a lower heart disease when eating such a terrible diet as was understood at the time. The reason that Fodor is stepping into this is because they're trying to point out that this group of explorers who noticed these lower incidence of heart disease actually didn't notice a lower incidence of heart disease, and much of the other data contradicts what they said about the Inuit and their rate of heart disease. So in response, this guy, James DiNicolantonio, wrote this article. It's actually an editorial, more of a perspective piece in the Open Heart BMJ journal about why Fodor is wrong, and actually the Eskimos did have a lower rate of cardiovascular disease. And so before we rush into the analysis, it's worth noting Dr. DiNicolantonio's background. DiNicolantonio, something like that. So he has a book with Joseph Mercola called Superfuel. Joseph Mercola is the well-known, basically proponent of many quack therapies on the internet, extremely famous and extremely wealthy. And he's also known for the salt fix, basically why you should eat a bunch of salt, and that's his perspective. And then another book with Jason Fung. So he's a popular book writer and to some degree less of an academic, and I think that this particular article is a reflection of that particular orientation. So before we start, the title is The Intake of Refined Carbohydrates May Have Led to the Health Decline of the Greenland Eskimos. So what this guy is going to argue is that Fodor's right, and that the Eskimos actually had a much higher rate of cardiovascular disease than the non-Eskimos of the surrounding territories and other people elsewhere in the world. But this is actually because they stopped eating their traditional diet and started eating a highly refined diet, a Western diet. But suffice to say, he's not really jumping into the question of whether or not Dyerberg and Bang were correct about the Inuit having lower cardiovascular disease than the surrounding people in the 1970s and a little bit before. He's actually just accepting that point that they didn't, that they had higher rates. He's trying to explain why they had these higher rates. So it has very little to do actually with the older argument about whether or not the Inuit diet was protective and if that was because of the fish oil. Because the older argument was really about whether or not fish oil is protective. And as we know, since that literature came into being, late 2018, basically the consensus is right now that fish oil has been a wash despite almost 50 years of studies. So he's not really jumping into that. He's trying to argue, okay, yeah, fine, maybe the Inuit did have a higher rate of cardiovascular disease, but it was for some other reasons, and in particular the introduction of refined carbohydrates. It's a very curious argument because it has nothing to do with any of the other arguments that other people are making. It's a new argument completely, and it's sort of tangential to the controversy about the Inuit in the first place. And I'm not going to argue. I'm going to show that it's kind of a weird argument also because the Inuit have never been demonstrated to have lower rates of cardiovascular disease at all in the first place. So, and James DiNicolantonio doesn't actually demonstrate this, that they ever actually did. So most of what this actually is sort of a hypothesis proposal with a lot of gaps in the evidence and not much intellectual firepower behind it. So let's begin and let us demonstrate that. So basically he talks about how the authors concluded that higher rates of cardiovascular disease, the Fodor et al., for example, Fodor et al., who we were just talking about, who DiNicolantonio is responding to. And then he says that, the reason is because that evidence came from 1979 or afterwards. And then he's like, yeah, that's true. They did have higher rates. But the authors did find one study in the late 1940s that confirmed a low risk in the Greenland Eskimo. Okay. And the author decided to investigate what dietary changes may have occurred that might explain the increase in atherosclerotic disease in Greenland Eskimos. Well, this doesn't really make any sense. There's two publications that talk about the atherosclerotic risk, and one publication actually is before this one in the 1940s by Bertelsen, and one is after, about 10 years later, by Erstrom, and the one that comes before, a higher rate of cardiovascular disease. So it's difficult to square the findings of these two studies and understand how they can fit together in a systematic picture of the cardiovascular disease risk of the Greenland Inuit. Because one that's coming before showing a higher rate, and the other one's coming after showing a lower rate, and then everything else that's coming after that is showing a higher rate again. So it's not like you see a steady decline. So he wants to talk about the support evidence first, the study of the two studies that came afterward. And he's going to talk about Erstrom's paper. And before, we don't even really need to go too deep into what he says. We can actually look at the data itself, but I do want to summarize very quickly. He looked at about 1,000 Eskimos and about 900 people from Korpo, Finland, between 1948 and 1949. And it's important to note that Finland, Korpo, Finland is in the southwest of Finland. And there are studies on the cardiovascular disease risk coming later than this point of people in the southwest of Finland. So we actually have some idea of what the cardiovascular disease rate of people from southwest Finland were relative to everybody else in the rest of the world. And we can talk about that evidence at some other point if people want to ask me about it. But for the purpose of this video, it's important to note that in Finland in general, as early as the late 60s, the Finnish were known to have the highest rate of cardiovascular disease in the Western world. Cardiovascular disease mortality rates. So they're going to compare, Erstrom is comparing Eskimos to people from Korpo who have the highest rate of cardiovascular disease in the world. Okay. So he's basically talking about what the criteria of this particular diagnosis is. And he says that they found the number of sclerotics to be 4 times lower in the Eskimos who have Umanak, than in Korpo. So 7.5% versus 29%. So that's a big problem. So now before moving on, let's actually look at the paper that DiNicolantonio is talking about, Erstrom's paper. And we see it here. Erstrom's paper. Before we continue, let's look at the age distribution of the different populations. And as you can see, the Umanak have a much lower range of people, a much younger range of people than the people from Corpo. In fact, you can see from the people of Corpo, there's many elderly, or a relatively high number of elderly. Even as late as 50, Corpo has almost 3 times as many, and then it just gets even more extreme over there. And the Umanak has a very low number of elderly and a very high number of youthful people. And Erstrom points this out with this particular age distribution chart that shows that you have a high number of young people in the sample and a high number of who are Umanak, who are Eskimos, and a high number of older people in the Corpo sample. So the age of the population of the Corpo people is much older. Nonetheless, despite this, the Umanak, which is the solid line, have a slightly higher rate of hypertension. In fact, the average blood pressure of somebody who is between the age of 50 and 60 is 160 millimeters mercury, which is very hypertensive. The average rate of somebody who is in their 60s is basically a hypertensive emergency. And as we can see, actually, the U.S. rate of hypertension is much lower than both of these. So this is the Corpo, this dashed one right here, and this is the U.S. one, this double dashed one down here. So Corpo has the highest rate of hypertension, so it doesn't bode so well for the cardiovascular health. And that's despite these people having a lower population age distribution, much lower. In fact, I even graphed the population age distribution here. Or I didn't graph it, but put it in a table. So we can see here the Umanak and the Corpo district. And what I did is I graphed the ratio of the percent of the population that each of these age groups represented. So in this case, once you get to about 30, into the 30s, you're already having far more people, or about a third more people in the Corpo district than you have in the Umanak district as a percentage of the population. As you get to the 50s, you have about 3 times as many, 60s about 3 times as many, and then 70s and above, actually if you just say everybody above 70, about 10 times as many people alive in the 70s and above. And interestingly, you have about 20 people of the total, I think, 900 people sampled who are in their 80s, and you have 0 among the Umanak. So you just have a lot more old people among the Corpo than the Umanak, and yet nonetheless the Umanak have much higher or a slightly higher rate of hypertension despite being much younger. Despite, in fact, the majority of the population being below 50. Actually, I think the majority of the population being below 40. So it's kind of sad. But hey, maybe hypertension isn't the big problem here. Maybe the big problem is arteriosclerosis. So let's look at arteriosclerosis, because that was looked at here. As we just saw, 75% among the Umanak and then 29% among the Corpo. And so that means the Corpo had about 4 times as many sclerotics as the Umanak in proportion to the total number of people examined. Well, that's not exactly true, because if you do 29 over 7.5, it's closer to about 3.9. Well, as we saw here, everybody above the Corpo people have about 4 times more people above the age of 60 than the Umanak, and about 3.4 people over the age of 50. So, and remember, as we said, it's only about 3.9 times the rate of cardiovascular disease than the Umanak, which means that if the majority of people with cardiovascular disease were actually in this particular group, that would actually make complete sense. If they're in this group, the Corpo would have slightly less cardiovascular, or slightly more cardiovascular disease than the Umanak. But as we saw, the rate of cardiovascular disease in Finland is much higher than it is anywhere else in the world, or significantly higher than most other places in the world, and much higher than many places in the world, including other westernized countries. So what this means is when you're comparing the Umanak to the Corpo, the rate of cardiovascular disease is very similar. In other words, the rate of cardiovascular disease among the Inuit is very close, very comparable on a age-adjusted basis to the rate of cardiovascular disease among the country with the highest rate of cardiovascular disease in the world. So this doesn't actually show that. This doesn't show much. It says, it cannot be denied that the incidence of clinical manifestation of arteriosclerosis in relation to the age distribution is lower in Umanak in North Greenland than it is in the Corpo district in southwest of Finland. Well, big whoop. Real big whoop, right? Because it's not a very impressive comparison. In fact, it's damning of the Umanak. It's damning of the Inuit. Yet, James takes this to mean that the Umanak were relatively free of cardiovascular disease compared to other Western populations. Really. And even actually Fodor makes this mistake as well, so unfortunately. So that's one piece of evidence, the strong piece of evidence before the 1970s showing that the Eskimos of Umanak had a low rate of cardiovascular disease, not very convincing. And the other one showed a higher rate. So it's probably a very similar rate versus a higher rate, and then the one that has a similar rate is among the people with the highest rate in the world. And he says, thus it can be assumed that the health of the Greenland Eskimos began to decline in the 1900s. He doesn't use any evidence to support that statement. Anything can be assumed, right? I mean, but at least you'd want to base some kind of assumption on evidence. But there's actually no evidence that the Greenland Eskimos ever had a low rate of cardiovascular disease, even before the 1900s. So, and he never cites any here in this entire paper. So why is he even making this assumption? And he's making this assumption in the same way maybe a blogger might make the assumption because he wants to think that it's the case, but without actually even providing any evidence at all. The only bit of evidence is the one piece of evidence we just saw, which is dubious, and then there's no other evidence that suggests that they ever had a low rate of cardiovascular disease. And then he starts talking about why this is the case. This assumption, which is not based on anything, is the case. And he starts talking about how the rate of carbohydrates went up. And it's important to actually look at this rate of carbohydrates. It actually is a very interesting publication, and I want to show it just for the sake of everyone's interest. But in any case, here is the rate of cardiovascular disease. Or not the rate of, but here is the... So here is the changes in the diet of the Inuit, and in particular the yearly per capita consumption of imported food products, 1901 to 1931. The change over that 30 years, it's gigantic. It's about a threefold increase in highly refined carbohydrates, and actually it's just a really large amount of refined carbohydrates. So there's something to this idea that refined carbohydrates could have contributed to a an increase in refined carbohydrates could have contributed to a decline in health of the Inuit, but then again, we don't ever actually see any decline. Interestingly, we should actually take a look at one particular piece of evidence. It was shown in 1993 that among, I think either 3 or 4 different Inuit and Aleutian mummies, some of them were ceremonial, some of them were naturally mummified, meaning you basically had an avalanche that happened, and then the mummy just the ice just trapped everybody underneath, and then the bodies became mummified naturally. And one of these is 1,600 years old. They all show coronary atherosclerosis in middle age. So it's not like we have any evidence or any strong evidence, or any evidence that I've been able to find so far, that the Inuit and the Aleutians ever had a low rate of cardiovascular disease, including 1,600 years ago, which is far before we ever had refined carbohydrates. And people can check out this article at this link here. Here. So you can pause the video and look at it. And this is a really cool article, by the way. The one caveat to this is that these particular mummies had signs of a lot of smoke inhalation. So that might have suggested that maybe the smoke caused the cardiovascular disease. But again, like, I don't know what the cause of the cardiovascular disease. All I know is that there was cardiovascular disease. There's no sign that there was ever no cardiovascular disease. So it could be true that they wouldn't have had cardiovascular disease had they not had been exposed to the smoke, but they were exposed to smoke and did have the cardiovascular disease. And so there's no sign that they never had it. So how can you ever say that, oh, they had an increase in the rate of cardiovascular disease, and you never even saw a low point in the first place? We only see high rates of cardiovascular disease as far as I can tell. There's another paper from, I think, I want to say 2013. And in fact, I have it right here. I don't even need to look that up. I have it right here, 2013. Atherosclerosis 4,000 years of human history, a horror study of poor ancient populations. Again, they looked at 5 Unangans, it looks like. They're in the Aleutian Islands, which is somewhat close to Alaska and has a very similar kind of diet. And if it's not close to Alaska, I mean, they just have a very similar diet to the Alaskans. And again, they find in everybody who has an artery bed that they can look at, of all the 4, so there's 4 who have an artery bed, and everybody who has a heart, at least remnants of a heart, so there's only 2 total who have remnants of a heart, both of those people have definite atherosclerosis, according to a CT scan. And one of these people is only in their late 40s, and the other one is in their mid-20s. And they both have signs of atherosclerosis. So again, I'm not saying that the diet is necessarily causing it, but we don't know that the diet in this population ever actually results in a low rate of cardiovascular disease. So it's kind of weird how he even talks about a low rate of cardiovascular disease. He never cites any of the evidence. And I read this almost 10 times. I looked and I couldn't find in a single place that he ever documented that. And in the one place he tried to document it from the 1940s, he documented the opposite. So he says, in summary, the intake of refined carbohydrates and sugar by the Greenland Eskimos increased in parallel to the increase in atherosclerotic disease. Considering that a similar event occurred in the U.S., and that the overconsumption of refined sugar is the principal driver of type 2 diabetes, hypertension, blah, 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 this most likely explains the health decline of the Greenland Eskimos. I actually haven't even looked at this citation yet. Oh, it's from his paper. It's a self-citation. In fact, 5 out of 14, so almost half of the citations in this paper are from James DiNicolantonio, which is kind of it's a little bit of a red flag. When you see that kind of thing, it looks like citation count is maybe being driven up. The rate of cardiovascular disease death in the United States has dramatically declined over the last 50 years, probably because of the lower rate of smoking, and perhaps because of the intake of polyunsaturated fatty acids, which have decreased the LDL cholesterol levels in the population, and triglycerides, and perhaps improved metabolism. This feels like a blog post that I wouldn't make because it's like half thought out, and yet it's constantly bandied about when people talk about the Inuit. So it's been talked about over 100 times, almost 150 times. And then every time you talk about the Inuit, somebody who loves low-carb diets will mention this particular publication. I just wanted to clear up how that doesn't make any sense. Thank you. Hey there, please use this video if you see somebody talking about the Inuit study and want to correct them on what evidence it actually uses to make its case. Also, if you have found this useful, please become my patron at the link below at patreon.com or make a one-time donation. I'll talk to you later.